Bava Batra Daf Gimel Amud Beis, non-verbal communication, lo tehei shmi'a gdula miraia. Only 7% of communication, of feeling, is derived through content, through the words that are used, through verbal communication. Everything else is, there are other methods of doing so. So in the area of evidence, in the area of edus, is there any case where a Beit Din can hear evidence non-verbally? It's an interesting idea. The one would think simply, no, of course not. There has to be verbal evidence in a Beit Din. We know that. But we'll see some interesting learning as we go through this. We're going to learn an amazing piece of Rabbi Edelstein. Rabbi Edelstein died only a year ago. He died last year and was known as the head of the Lithuanian yeshiva world, certainly for the last years of his life. A very, very fascinating Talmud Chacham, a Rosh Yeshiva in Ponevezh, with such a fresh approach. And if one looks at his upbringing, one realizes he kind of co-led the yeshiva world with Reb Chaim Kanievsky for the last years of both of their lives. Reb Chaim Kanievsky was very difficult to access. So if he was, his mind was just so much in a different space. One could get answers from him, one could get direction from him, but it was very hard to connect with him. Reb Gershon was the opposite. Reb Gershon was very easy to connect to. If Reb Chaim was the head, the mind, the brain of the Jewish people, of the yeshivish world for that time, then Reb Gershon was the heart. And it's interesting because in his development, he was taught when he was young, he had a Chabad Rebbe. So he got a little bit of that part of it in. And then when his family, his father came to Eretz Yisrael in the 1930s, they settled down the road in Ramat HaSharon. And he grew up in Ramat HaSharon. And his father taught him, they used to sit on orange boxes, they say. And his father used to learn Torah, used to learn Gemara with him for years and years. And then he was close to the Chazon Ish, the Ponevezh Rov got to know about him and got to know him. He started teaching young school kids in the Ponevezh system, and later on became the Rosh Yeshiva in the Ponevezh system. And we miss him terribly. One of my regrets since coming to Eretz Yisrael is that I didn't go and see him and get to know him in the years that he was still alive. He introduced such normality and humanity into the Haredi world. An understanding, for example, he held and said publicly, he wasn't always popular for it, a non-religious person who's willing to give his life to protect the Jewish people is on a higher madrega than a religious person, no matter what he does. And that we have to relate to people in that way. And that even the most secular and anti-religious people are only that because they've had a negative experience with Yiddishkeit. They're only that way because they weren't taught well, or they saw something they couldn't relate to, or they're ignorant, they weren't taught at all. He just held, similar to Rav Kook, who had an influence in his father's life, just believed in the inner goodness of people and of Jewish people, and he lived that and he taught that. Also, he was a master educator, and he believed that you had to adapt your teaching to the needs of the student. You couldn't have a standard system of teaching for everybody. People are different, they need to be taught in different ways, and that teaching should, particularly Torah, should never be compelled on a student. It's the educator's job, it's the Rav's job to make the Torah interesting so that the student wants to learn. It's not his job to force it into the child. And he was very vocal about his methods. And you see his freshness of approach in his learning, which is now available in printed form. And he answers a question of Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, which Rabbi Chanan leaves as a question. His question is slightly different, but it answers Rabbi Chanan's question as well, and derives an unbelievably modern understanding of the Nimuchei Yosef. Now, the Nimuchei Yosef is himself a modern Rishon. He was in the late period of the Rishonim, it was the 15th century. Beginning of the 15th century, says at the end of the period of Rishonim, and one sees modern trends in the thinking of the Nimuchei Yosef. This particular piece of Nimuchei Yosef that we learn is actually from the Ritva, part of the same school. And the way Reb Gershon explains it is just absolutely magnificent. The shir is dedicated by Ruth and Ron Cotton, who are followers of ours, Talmidim, who listen to the Matmonim every day. They're important people in the community in Netanya. And their message is just, we would like to thank Hashem for the blessing of bringing us to Eretz Yisrael, and for his seen and unseen miracles and protection that we experience every single day. So thank you to Ruth and Ron Cotton for your support and your encouragement. We'd love to have you with us. So the part of the Gemara that we're going to deal with is just the bold part where we have a memra of Rav Yehuda, Shlosha shenichnesu levaker et hacholeh. 3 people go in to visit a sick man, a man who's dying. And they go in for the purpose of visiting socially. Ratzu kotvim ratzu osin din. And while they're there, the man distributes his estate. And in the presence of these 3 people, they could decide among themselves that they are judges, and this is a Beit Din, and they could decide that they are witnesses, they are edim. They are observing something and they can give evidence afterwards. Of course, the issue is the sons argue later on as to what took place. They could say, look, we're Beit Din. We executed on that will. We were present. The man distributed his estate and we gave the stamp of approval. It can't be questioned anymore. This is a Maaseh Beit Din, it's been executed by a Beit Din. Or they can say, no, we observed it, we're witnesses. They have the option to decide what their status is at that point. That's the piece that we're going to focus on. The context for it at the moment isn't going to be relevant to our discussion. Asks the Rashbam. Now, what we need to know is a few principles here. We need to know the principle of mipi shnayim edim. The Torah says you've got to hear evidence from the mouth of witnesses. Mipiyem velo miktavim, Chazal say. It has to be from their mouth. They can't send it in writing. There has to be oral evidence. And part of the reason for that is because a court case must be something that if you're observing it, you understand what's going on and you see how they got to their conclusion. The Dayanim can't just say, in our opinion it should be A or it should be B. You've got to be able to see how they got to that. So the claimant has to state his case. The defendant has to defend himself. They must bring witnesses to support. You must hear the witnesses. Then when the Dayanim, when the judges give their judgment, you understand the context and you understand where it goes from. So it must be independently observable. It can't be a subjective opinion that the Dayanim just say, in our opinion, A or B, except in certain circumstances. So that's the one thing, you need oral evidence. On the other hand, we have a principle which we'll learn that in certain cases, lo tihei shmi'a gdula mirayaa. Surely hearing from witnesses isn't stronger than actually seeing it yourself. So surely if the Dayanim, if the judges see the event, do they need witnesses? But we do have a principle of ein eid na'aseh dayan. If you've observed, you can't become a judge. If you were present when the thing happened, then you're a witness, you're not a judge. So there's a separation of witness and judge, and yet there's an idea of lo tehei shmi'a gdula mirayaa. Surely if you can listen and you can hear, surely seeing is even better. And then we have the principle of hodat bal din k'mea edim dami, that if in the presence of a Beit Din an individual acknowledges indebtedness, that's as if we have witnesses for it. So if a man says in front of a Beit Din, I acknowledge, although there is no evidence, there's no documentation, and Chaimke here doesn't even remember, but I owe him $1,000. And then Chaimke tries to get the $1,000 from this person, and he denies it, he delays, so he brings him back to Beit Din. And this person says, but you don't have any evidence that I owed you. And he said, you're the evidence. You said in front of Beit Din, we don't need any more evidence. Those are the pieces that we need to understand for this Rashbam. The Rashbam asks on our Gemara here, how can they be a Beit Din? So you've got a man dying. He distributes his estate. I understand they're witnesses. They observe the distribution, and later on they can give evidence in Beit Din that they observed the distribution. But how can they be the Beit Din? Who are the witnesses? A Beit Din requires witnesses. Here you've got the litigants, you've got the father, you've got the sons, but where are the witnesses? V'avagav de'en kan adam sheme'id bifneihem, asked the Rashban. Klum ha'parchinen b'Rosh Hashanah lo tehei shmi'a gdola mirayaa. Didn't we say in Rosh Hashanah that seeing something is greater than listening? You don't need witnesses. You're seeing it in front of your eyes. And since they see the sick person distributing his estate, it's as if the person himself is acknowledging indebtedness. He's saying, I want Reuven to have this, and I want Shimon to have this, and I want Levi to have that. He distributes all. So what do you need witnesses for anymore? You don't need witnesses in this case. So there's some difficulties with the Rashbam. Firstly, part of the difficulty is this: lo tehei shmi'a gdola mirayaa is a principle in Rosh Chodesh. It's a principle specifically in Kiddush HaChodesh, that if a Beit Din sees the new moon themselves, they don't need evidence, they don't need edim, again in certain circumstances. And in cases of Kiyum Shtarot, which is a different situation, but generally you do need witnesses. Generally, if the judges saw the event, the judges saw A lend money to B, they can't judge on the basis of that. Then a year later, B comes to claim money from A, and the Beit Din says, yeah, we were there, we saw it. Well, if you saw it, you're aiding. So you can now be the witnesses, let's hire some judges. You can't be witness and judge. So why here is the Rashbam so quick to employ the principle of Lo Tehei Shmi'a Gdola Miraia? And Rabbi Wasserman asks the question, why do you need both principles? It says, why do you need this principle of, surely if you see it yourself, that's better than hearing it? You've got one principle, he's acknowledged, the father's acknowledged his indebtedness in front of the children. These people were there. That's a hodah. That's the same as somebody saying, I owe Chaimke $1,000. The father is saying, I want these children to have these pieces of my estate. So you've got the Beit Din himself, the litigant himself, the party himself is saying out loud what he wants done. What more do you need than that? Why do you need Lo Tehei Shmi'a Gdola Miraia? R Edelstein formulates the question in the opposite way, but it's the same kind of question. And his answer is based on the Nimuchei Yosef. The Nimuchei Yosef quotes the Ritva. And the Nimuchei Yosef says an amazing thing, which we'll understand through the eyes of Reb Gershon. Ma shetziva bifneihem, says the Nimuchei Yosef, chashuv kehagadat eidim. There are witnesses, says the Nimuchei Yosef. It's not quite as the Rashbam says, or is developed. When the Rashbam says, why do you need witnesses? He means, why do you need additional witnesses? The fact that the father articulated his desire, that articulation is evidence. That's the principle of Hodat Beit Din K'mei Eidim. It's not that if you have Hodat Beit Din, if the litigant himself, if the claimant himself, or the respondent declares his responsibility, it's not that you don't need witnesses. He is the witness. The only time you need Haggadah means a witness articulating his evidence, is to prevent judges making decisions just based on something they saw where there was no articulation of anything, there was only experience, there was only vision, there was no hearing of anything. Or shiyudim shelo mipi bal davar zeh. Or he knows it from some other, he just has information. You can't decide a court case based on information you've picked up on the internet somewhere. It's got to be information that you got from an authoritative source who articulates it. Rabbi Gershon goes in to explain the Nimuchei Yosef in order to answer his question and Rabbi Wasserman's question. It's interesting that the name of his sefer was Mimeged Gerish Yerachim, which comes from this week's parasha, from the next parasha, from Zot HaBracha. And it means, in the parasha, it means that the blessing that the fields give continuously new fruit, that there's seasonal fruit, always new fruit. And it's just a lovely name for his sefer because it is so fresh and renewing. This was a shir he gave in Tafshin Ayin in 2010, not long ago. And then he brings in the second paragraph for Tiritz and Nimuchei Yosef, Yesh Lomar, he brings it. And then he asks at the end of the second paragraph, V'tzarich biur bekavanato, we have to understand the Nimuchei Yosef. T'sof sof hara'u rak ma'aseh shemechalek nechasav, v'lama ein chisaron haggadah. At the end of the day, there wasn't evidence. He saw an event. He saw a father dishing out an estate. There wasn't evidence. There aren't witnesses. What does the Nimuchei Yosef mean that these are the witnesses? And he says, "V'tzarich lomer hagadat habal din ze havi gamken kamo hagadat edut dema nafka mina im shom'im hamaaseh mipi edin u'ma'aminim lahem or sheshom'im hamaaseh mipi habal davar atzmo u'ma'aminim lo." The principle of Hodat Beit Din K'mei Eidim Dami means that if you hear something and you have the right to believe what you hear because it's authoritative, that's edus. You might hear it from Eidim, or you might hear it from the Baal Davar, you might hear it from the litigant. If it's from an authoritative source, that is called Haggadah. That's called Eidus. Vavi Mamash Haggadah, that is Eidus. Now comes the brilliant piece. V'hu adin im eino medaber elehem. And this can apply even if he doesn't speak. This is wild, but it's in the Nimuchei Yosef that he extracts this from. And the same applies if he doesn't speak. There's no verbal communication. He does something to act something out, to communicate by an action, rather than to communicate by words. Yes, you can communicate by words, but you can sometimes communicate by an action. And we know that in acting, we know in miming, how much communication, how much you can tell in dance, how much you can communicate to an audience without saying a word, just by the movement of body. So in situations where a person is communicating by action rather than words, nami chashiv Haggadah. That's also Haggadah. Amazing chidush. The Haggadat edut hainu ma shemedabrim lifnei hadayanim diyesh lashon Haggadah v'yesh lashon Amira. Rabbi Gershon distinguishes between the word Haggadah and Amira. Amira, he says, you can say in your own room when there's nobody listening. You say Kriya Shema, that's Amira. You can talk to yourself, that's Amira. Haggadah is you talking to somebody, you're telling something, you're telling someone something. That's Haggadah. Umashna im magid lahem al yedei chush hashmiya or al yedei chush hariyah. What difference should it make if I tell you something using your ears or using your eyes? If I communicate to you verbally through your ears or I communicate through your eyes, they're both forms of Haggadah. If they just saw something, he did no communicating. The judges just saw. They were present and they noticed something, they saw something. That's not okay. There's no Haggadah. But if the litigant or Eidim communicate to the Dayanim, they tell something to the Dayanim with the intention of communicating, but it was done without words, that is still Haggadah. Haggadah doesn't have to be verbal, is what Rabbi Gershon is mechadish in the Nebuchadnezzar Yosef. אבל אם הראייה הייתה על ידי שהבעל דובר עשה המעשה בפניהם ונתכוון שיראו, if his intention was that they should see his action and understand information from that action, תהראה להם המעשה, זה הביא ממש כמו הודעת בעל דבר בפניהם, תחשיב הגדה. This as well is considered the Baal Dover giving information, giving his edut, and it's like 100 edim. And so we just see this development of this idea, how alert we have to be when we listen. As I said, only 7% of communication when there's an emotion involved is considered to be verbal. And that's why on the telephone people have so many misunderstandings, because you don't have the nonverbal clues. And so much is the nonverbal clues. And when you're listening to somebody, it's really important to be watching that person, to be watching the person's eyes, the person's face, the expressions, the hand movement. If you're listening to somebody and you're on your phone, you're getting maybe 7% because you're multitasking, so you're probably getting even less than 7%. If you're sitting in a chair and you're on your phone or you're doing something else, you're not hearing. The importance of being able to employ the whole body in the listening process, but particularly the eyes, because listening is energetic. You're listening to a person's energy. The way they project their energy is through different things, through words, through tone of voice, and through body language. Those are the ways they project the energy, but what you're picking up is the energy. You're picking up the inner place. You're picking up what's in their heart. You're not picking up what's in their mouths. What's in their mouths are they've chosen words that they want to have a specific effect. But you want to know what they're really feeling. You want to know what's really going on in their hearts. For that you need your eyes too. You can't just listen with your ears. So much so that according to the Nebuchadnezzar Yosef, as Rabbi Gershon explains it, even when a Beit Din expresses himself without words only through an action, that in itself can still be called Haggadat Eidim, because the power of communication is not only in words, it's also in what we see.